Joe Klemczewski, welcome to the show. Honored and excited to have you on my show because I've been following your work and it's been such a great source of wisdom and knowledge around anything to do with flexible dieting, a different approach to nutrition, in addition to all the different things that I've been looking up to you around contest prep, management of the physique of an athlete, the transformation that goes from all the phases of contest prep, not just towards the show, but after the show, and all the different things that are going to affect the outcome by the end of a long-term or short-term prep based on what you want to work with your athletes. But before we even go into any of the questions that I have prepped for you today, talk to me about why you do what you do and why contest prep, why nutrition, why physique sports.
Great, great. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. Very honored to be with you as well. It is funny at this stage of my career to look back at those beginning points that did prompt me to go in this direction because I think we all have a commonality in that at some point we were all interested in performance sports or just how we looked going through our own childhoods. And I was certainly no different. I wanted to improve my performance in baseball. As I was entering my teen years, I was interested in changing how I looked for just the normal growing up kind of reasons. And then by the time I was in college and moving toward a business management and administration degree, something just kind of gnawed at me that I love the sport of bodybuilding. I was kind of growing up through the 80s and pre-social media. It seemed like a little bit of a smaller community. You had to go to Muscle and Fitness magazine and Flex magazine to get all the information about the athletes. Everybody was following Lee Haney and then Dorian Yates and so forth. So once I was in college and bodybuilding for the express purpose of competing, I just kind of made a right turn into physical therapy because I thought instead of doing something in business, which I didn't even know what that would entail for a life or a career, just seemed so general. I had to find something that matched my interests in sport and not even necessarily nutrition at the time, but exercise science wasn't really even a thing academically at the time. So the closest thing I could find was becoming an orthopedic physical therapist. And then about that time, when I had graduated and I was working in physical therapy, I had won my pro card with the WNBF. So now I was competing at a higher level. And I was just in that mindset of school and academia, and I did find some schools that had some programs in nutrition, and so I part-time kept going to school, ended up with a doctorate in nutrition, and that led me to writing for the magazines that the WNBF, World Natural Bodybuilding Federation, owned. They had 5 or 6 different magazines in a conglomerate in New York City. So they asked me to start writing for them. I became their chief science editor, and that kind of just created an opportunity for writing at that point. I was always interested in English and writing and literature, but just a perfect storm of being in the right place at the right time led me to needing, like I had to every single month, have a couple articles for their different publications and magazines. So around that time, I had decided to leave physical therapy and purchase a gym, a small boutique gym that I created into more of a corporate wellness center. So I could then start using my nutrition knowledge and do some nutrition programming, writing for the magazines, competing at a higher level in the WNBF. At one point, as I was speaking at different science conferences and fitness camps, it dawned on me that I kept getting all of these questions. How can I do what you're doing? How can I do nutrition coaching, nutrition consulting? And of course, you being a licensed or registered dietitian, you know, at least here in the United States, it was quite blocked. There were some legislative hoops that you had to jump through. So I ended up needing to make sure I could create a licensing program where by hiring a registered dietitian and even a medical director, working with an intellectual property attorney, we could create the avenue for that. So even around that time in the late 90s, early 2000s, we created the whole prospect of nutrition coaching, something that had never been done before, because if you're not a registered dietitian, you were just legislatively disallowed. So this kind of accidentally created the non-dietitian nutrition coaching occupation. So that's kind of how it all converged way back then. And now I've been doing it for another 30 years on top of that.
You focus just on like lifestyle clients and competitive clients, or just competitive clients that are just going to do contest prep, physique sports?
Originally, it was just lifestyle clients through our facility. And then as I was writing for one of the magazines I wrote for was called Natural Bodybuilding and Fitness. Now it's no longer in publication. And so a lot of people, including Lane Norton, Eric Helms, people like that, learned about me. Lane, even hired me to be his coach for his first couple bodybuilding contests. And so through that avenue, I gradually started coaching nutrition clients specifically for competition, probably right around 2000, maybe 2001.
And then since then, you've been doing mostly bodybuilding prep?
It's still about half and half.
Okay.
Most of the coaches that we certify and mentor now do more lifestyle coaching, but we certainly have a handful who are coming out of the bodybuilding world just because that's where I started. So a lot of people still know me from that.
I've got so many things that I need to ask you today. I am super pumped to get started. So the way I'm going to structure this is I have a few questions that are a bit of a longer answer type questions that are more thought-provoking. And then we can move to a more rapid fire Q&A questions that are just meant to be fun, get you to answer a question, whether it's yes or no, true or false, overrated, underrated, this or that. And this is more to see what are your preferences in terms of these specific questions, and maybe just giving me a little bit of rationale why you choose that answer. So let's get started with the first part. I have been looking into different areas that a person that is going through any area of prep or bodybuilding can find some hurdles and challenges along the way. One of those is usually late night cravings. What are your best tips for clients who struggle with these intense cravings at night?
It kind of depends on looking at the whole day, starting with, do you even have the energy balance you need to get through the day? A lot of people try to diet too aggressively on too few calories. And so one of the things I want to make sure people do start with it is a realistic expectation of how much they should be eating, and making sure that they're not trying to lose too quickly. But then as far as how you organize the day, it really depends also on where you spend your most energy. So if somebody is training at night or late afternoon, for example, that may increase metabolism a little bit, and perhaps they're not saving enough food for later in the day. I think you can definitely get into some very standard or cliche answers, such as, making sure you have at least a good portion of protein pretty close to bedtime, something that's not necessarily going to, disrupt sleeping or limit body fat, use for energy through the night. But I definitely have some clients once in a while who will tell me that. They'll express, I'm just waking up really hungry, especially toward the end of a diet where your fat stores are incredibly limited. I mean, you can wake up really, really hungry. And at that point, my best answer is we want to avoid that. We don't want you to wake up, but perhaps just having a little bit of a routine where you wake up, grab some water, maybe even a half a scoop of protein powder or something like that. That would be kind of a worst case scenario where you actually are disrupting your sleep to eat something. So most people can manage that just by having at least a small meal closer to bedtime.
I usually find that some people obviously closer to show maybe 12 weeks out when energy deficit is quite significant, and especially because you're trying to get this client shredded and peeled, the hunger is just going to be present and cravings are going to be there anyways. And sometimes even sleep is going to be impacted nonetheless. So how do you manage that? Because you kind of like try to balance, well, I really need to recover. I need to prioritize my sleep, but because I'm so hungry, and sometimes it may not necessarily be cravings, but it's just actual physical hunger that is completely making so hard to actually fall asleep. And sometimes having very light sleep all the night throughout, you can't even recover properly. What are your recommendations in these situations where sleep is at risk or very, very light and it's not leading to proper recovery?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the difference between true physiological hunger and cravings because I remember when I was competing, there's just this mindset that either hunger and cravings are horrible, it's suffering, I feel terribly, uh, or it's just part of the process. It's just the mindset that it's just a sensation and I can ignore it. And a lot of times that true physiological hunger will even go away. So I remember, for example, when I was highly motivated, probably near the end of my competitive career, and I would just, I really wanted to do my best. I wanted to make sure there was nothing between me and being able to say, I retired having given it my all. I've gone through a perfect contest prep. And I would actually be happy going to bed hungry. If I was hungry and I felt empty, I would go to sleep with a smile on my face, knowing I would wake up leaner and lighter and making progress. If I went to bed and I didn't feel hungry, I would be a little nervous, like, wow, maybe I overdid it. So mindset definitely comes into play, but true ravenous hunger where your stomach just feels like it's burning, it's empty, and so forth, we truly have to avoid. So we have to switch some food around so that you're not feeling that way. Or, like I said, if you inevitably, as you mentioned toward the end of prep, if you're just going to do that, you've got to have a strategy. Sometimes even something like some warm tea or something just to at least get you to sleep properly, where you don't you're not disrupted by even falling to sleep by those cravings or hunger.
So in this situation, what would be your usual recommendations, your best tips for these individuals that are trying to manage this extreme hunger, but they need to adhere to that deficit? Like sometimes,
Mhm.
like you will find athletes like yourself that they're very strong-minded and they will be happy to be hungry and knowing that, yeah, this is part of the process, this is fine. But maybe you start getting that maturity the more you do shows and the more you evolve in bodybuilding prep. But maybe a very first physique competitor that has never experienced all these different things that are happening in our bodies is the first time you feel so hungry. Is the first time you're doing so many new things like I did for my first show. It was like I learned so much about what true hunger was, what um, a lot more about my body, a lot more about myself. There's a point where you may be at risk of not adhering to the deficit as you wish you could.
Mhm.
So, what are the things that you usually tend to put in order with a client that are going to lead for this client to be more adherent to the diet? Is it around fiber, protein? We know that all of these things that increase satiety, maybe just distribution of calories and the type and the volume of the foods and all these things that we probably already have been managing for like any sort of dieting strategy to be successful. But is anything else that you think this is the main thing that helps with adherence in a deficit?
It's always to me a combination of both the psychology and the physiology. So
Hmm.
the main thing first is to understand what's realistic for your body type and your metabolism. So for me, for example, I'm a little bit on the endomorphic side, and even as a young, healthy male, I could just never lose more than about a pound a week of body fat. And I had friends and clients who could lose two. And I just always thought, why? Like I'm feeling this intense hunger. If I diet any harder, do any more cardio, I'm losing more muscle than body fat. And that was just the pace that fit my metabolism and my phenotype. So being realistic with that is important. And then I like that you use the phrase, when somebody needs to or has to adhere to that energy deficit. And I would push back a little bit and say nobody needs to adhere to a calorie deficit. Sometimes we need a diet break. Sometimes we need to be realistic and pull back a little bit as far as how fast we're losing. Matter of fact, the slower somebody loses, of course, the more they're going to protect lean body mass and increase long-term compliance because they're just not struggling as much. So I think anytime somebody is getting so close to that line that they're feeling extreme hunger, they're risking binges, and just food becomes an obsession. It's always top of mind. I think they're probably physiologically going too close to that line. There are always psychological and behavioral things that we tie into our behavior. There's no doubt about that. But a lot of people just focus on the behavior and the psychology, and they ignore the physiology. And there are just some physiological limits to how far and how fast we can push.
What if it's you're so deep into prep, like maybe you don't have the flexibility to include a diet break, or maybe you don't have the flexibility to, well, there's no other show. Like, for example, there's countries like in Australia, like if you're gonna compete, there's like season A, season B, and if these are the federations, there's no other time. Like you gotta be ready by then. So it comes with the question, should I just wait for another season, which means
Mhm.
extending your prep 6 more months, or we need to adhere to this deficit. There's no
Mhm.
other way if you really want to compete. So in these situations, it kind of becomes a little bit more tighter and trickier to kind of pull off from the diet or increase the energy intake in a given time. What are some strategies that you have to implement in these situations where there's not much room to
Mhm.
make the decision, and maybe the client doesn't really like, I don't want to give up my plan. I don't want to just give up or quit because I just need to find a strategy that will help me get through this hurdle and adhere as much as possible, because wholeheartedly they want to do their best, but sometimes it could be something else that is impacting them, which is obviously that extreme hunger, that physiological hunger. Maybe is stress, maybe is other things that could be psychological on top of physiological. And when you combine these two things, can be a very dangerous place to be, because that's where a lot of competitors tend to fall into binging episodes or emotional eating, or just risking everything just because they're not in a good place. So if we were to look at technical strategies, maybe around manipulating carbohydrate intake, manipulating exercise, manipulating certain variables, what do you do with this overall to make sure there's a way to still be on track and adhere to this deficit?
As you were talking, that's exactly where I was going to go next. Is I think there's always room for really good experimentation with your macronutrient distribution. Maybe you do better with a little bit more fat, a little less carbohydrate, even at different times of the day. I know for some people, for example, I all of the research is very clear that having more food earlier in the day is helpful for maintaining hunger status as well as just metabolic capacity. But for again somebody who may be training at night or their shift is different in work, maybe they do need to alter some things and see what works. But One of the things I want to make sure I double down on is, as you mentioned, should you just delay it for 6 months and just give up this end of the season? If you have a car engine that can only go 8,000 RPMs and you push it to 12,000, you're going to blow the engine. So you're never going to get to the finish line. You're just not going to finish. You're going to crash and burn. And a binge is doing that. It's blowing your engine. You were just pushing too far, too fast. You couldn't maintain it. So in the old parable of the tortoise and the hare, the tortoise wins every time. Slow and steady. They just knew their pace, and they're the ones who finish. And so I would always say that's something you have to watch for and monitor. But at the same time, assuming we are going as well as we can and we're working as hard as we can and we're going to finish, we're going to hit that contest prep, but we're really close to that line. I know what this is like. I competed for 20 years. To feel the pressure psychologically and just know the stress is there. You're flying to a different country, you're going to compete, you have to do your best. This is where I think you find out how difficult the sport is, as you mentioned, even for your first contest prep. Like, wow, this is way harder than I thought. And some people can handle that better. Different personality traits, people who are just high in conscientiousness. And we look at the classic Stanford marshmallow study. I have seen clients, I've seen staff members and friends and coaches who just are so rock solid. They will suffer through anything. They will do anything and they just never break. And I don't think that's very typical. They exist, but most of us do have a breaking point. And when we're riding that close to the line, I think you're exactly right. Experiment, manipulate. Maybe you do better with 3 or 4 meals a day, maybe 5 or 6. Maybe you're front loading or back loading food intake at the beginning or end of the day. I really try to experiment with all those things with clients to see what works best.
It's tricky sometimes when we are playing with food volume and fiber intake. And this is probably coming from also personal experience and also timing, because when you probably are experimenting, well, let's say, let's try to do just 2 big meals a day where I feel very full, very satiated. There's less risk that I am going to be super hungry, and that may fit your lifestyle. Let's say you work, like in my example, I work in a hospital part-time. So from 11 a.m. all the way to 6 p.m., I am going to be in hospital. And I usually don't like bringing food or anything with me. It's just like a go, go, go thing. So it probably fits my lifestyle when I do have a huge breakfast and a huge dinner, and I can manage pretty well the food, the volume, and it could be very good for me to just use the breakfast and the energy that I take there all the way throughout the day. So I'm not thinking about food, I'm not stressing about any of that. And then at night, once I have completed my training session, I can have a big meal and dinner and go to bed happy and full. The thing is this optimal? Fat burners say not just a strategy, but what we're really trying to achieve in terms of body composition changes? Or do we think is adherence, calories and protein for the most part, the biggest thing that we should be focusing on? And based on research, there's no major difference whether you consume a small meal, a small frequent meals throughout the day, and a small even protein intake throughout the day, as long as you hit your requirements by the end of the day and you're getting most of your protein, all your protein requirements, and you're getting your deficit exactly where they should be. Carbs and fats don't really make a huge difference if some days they are a little bit higher, some days a little bit lower. How do you play with all of these variables? And what for you, what do you think is important to you by the end of the day?
I'm going to mix some research with just some what I would call common knowledge physiology. And when Dr. Bill Campbell was president of the ISSN, they did a systematic review looking at meal frequency, if there would really be a difference in performance in body fat loss, muscle preservation, et cetera. And they found that with an isocaloric comparison, it really came down to about 2 to 7 meals. As long as you didn't have one meal a day, but you had at least two, and you went as high as 6 or 7 meals, there was really no difference. And so it does come down to your tolerance, which may reflect back into your phenotype a little bit. Certainly, an occupation like yours, it just works better. And so your level of busyness may dictate that that's a little easier for you, where somebody else who's sitting around just thinking about hunger, it may not work as well. I do think the more active somebody is, so if you're more sedentary, doing this for general weight loss, that's where intermittent fasting and longer meal breaks can be helpful for some people. They can with more time between meals, you can dip a little bit deeper into lipolysis that way. If you're super active, you're doing cardio, you're training, that is going to increase hunger situationally during the day. So I find for most people, getting closer to 3 to 5 meals a day is better. So you can have some pre-workout or post-workout more strategically. But again, I think anybody who tries to stick to just one methodology or one type of schedule without at least being observant of their own intuitions, I think can kind of miss the mark, because just like sleep or recovery, this training day may have been harder than this one. This is a training day. This is a rest day. Sometimes you just feel very differently, and you could have the best laid plan, and you think your day is going to go like this, and sometimes it just doesn't work out that well. I have certainly been in a situation where I think this is going to be my schedule, and I'm so hungry, I almost have to double up a couple of meals. I eat one meal and I'm just still so hungry, I kind of eat the next meal. Then, like you, I basically induced a larger meal, and now I can go a longer period of time before the next meal. So again, a great place to be a little bit intuitive and observant of yourself and give yourself some flexibility. And even that, Astrid, goes into, is a day the only and the best unit of measurement? I mean, if I want to have a certain amount of calories or carbohydrates, protein, and fat in a week, maybe this particular day I just really had an extra biological need for a little more food, and a day or two later I don't. And so I can exchange a little bit of energy intake from one day to the next. So I just think a lot of these things have to come into play where we're not quite as rigid. The whole reason I created macronutrient tracking as the first form of flexible dieting was so that we didn't have to follow rigid meal plans. So the very next thing the industry did was took that level of flexibility and made it more rigid again on macronutrients. So instead of everybody being stringent and strict with meals and food sources, now they were being just as rigid and strict with macronutrients. And I think we need to let go of some of those concepts and at least blend in enough intuition, because that's how biology works. We're going to use a different amount of energy every single day, no matter how consistent we are with what we think our schedule is for training and recovery.
Listening to what you're saying, would you say that it is always better to approach contest prep with a flexible dieting approach versus using a meal plan? When would you use a meal plan, or when do you think meal plans are necessary?
That's another great question. I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm so used to this, I almost forget. Structure is still great. It was in the early 90s when I was writing for these magazines and competing as a new pro myself, that I really started to buck that trend. And I just, as a college student myself, I felt so constrained financially and with my schedule. I'm working up to 5 jobs at a time, going to school full time, and I just couldn't stick to a meal plan, couldn't eat chicken breast 6 times a day. So, I was in school, I was going through chemistry and biochemistry and all these courses and pre-med, and I just had this mindset of, what are these people trying to accomplish when I'm reading these other authors of magazines, like when they give a meal plan, what are they trying to accomplish? So I reverse engineered the amount of food they were suggesting, and I'm just kind of seeing who is suggesting what levels of food. And that's when I just very simply reverse engineered a budget for food. This is how much protein, carbs, and fat this person is saying they consume, and this is Mr. Olympia what he eats, and what this person is saying. But then what a lot of people took from my early work was to say, oh, if it's all about just the numbers, well, you can eat pizza and donuts and candy, and it doesn't matter because it's just about the numbers. But that, of course, is not aligned with very good health values. It certainly is going to affect your performance and even, hunger levels. So even to this day, I describe flexible dieting as eating the foods you like in the amounts you need to reach your goal. And that includes your health values. If I'm going to eat the foods I like, I still want them to be on the healthy side if that's part of my health orientation. So structure is a part of all of that. We all eat a very relatively few food sources throughout the week, even if we're not dieting, even if we don't have a goal. We just don't eat everything in the world that comes, in front of us. We're very selective as human beings with our habits. So I think it's incredibly helpful to have a meal plan and a schedule that you have inputted into. You know what's the foods you like. You know what's what works for your schedule. For your work situation, for example, maybe some days it's just 2 meals a day. That's perfectly fine. But then you also have to have the ability to adjust when you need to. If you don't have those foods available or your schedule goes crazy and you can't eat what you thought you could, you still have to fall back on the language of nutrition, which is math. You know, if I can't get exactly what I had planned, what's my next best step? How do I get relatively the same foods and the same amounts that I need to still accomplish my goals? So there's a lot of structure and meal planning that we can rely on, but we still have to have the ability and the knowledge to then be flexible.
These same apply when it comes to peak week, show day.
Very good. So I definitely want more consistency there
Hmm.
because your physiology is going to change, and based on the foods you eat, if you're 6 or 7 days out and you have a crazy day and you can't eat the meals you want when you want, it's not going to matter. But when you get 2 or 3 days in and you're talking about digestion and sleep and even the allocation throughout the day of how much sodium you're consuming at what parts of the day, then it definitely starts to matter because your body is seeking homeostasis. And so the more consistent and deliberate you can be, the easier it's going to be to control those variables.
Thinking about peak week, which is probably a little bit more of a stricter week when it comes to consistency and eating specific things that are going to lead to your best physique by show day. How important is the allocation of or reduction of fiber intake? Because if you're doing like a bit of a more flexible planning, where does the fiber intake fit in with all this planning? Because again, you could be super hungry, and the more peeled you get, the hungrier you get, and you could be potentially looking to increase your food volume. Or is it 2 meals a day still appropriate in this period of time where you have to be a bit more deliberate with how you manage your hunger? The food volume has to be probably lower. Fiber needs to be lower, especially 3 days out if you don't want to be having like, I don't know, a lot of food in your stomach and risk your, I don't know, your core volume and your core control. So things may become a little bit more important to pay attention to and maybe to adjust. What is optimal when it comes to peak week in terms of meal planning, in terms of fiber intake? These things are going to play an important role. Food volume. What are your thoughts in this specific part?
You're making me think that I even need to spend more time talking to clients about this because these are things that impact our health and our just functionality all the time, and we shouldn't wait until peak week. For example, you mentioned reducing fiber and perhaps the feeling of just bloating and being gassy and having extra flatulence and so forth. You should not feel that way and be experiencing that anytime. So if you are probably consuming too much fiber or too much of a certain type of fiber. So a lot of people needlessly feel symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, colitis, even getting into ulcerative colitis and lifelong problems because they're just eating way too much fiber, trying to seek that volumetric answer. They're thinking, well, it's I can eat more food in volume if it's higher in fiber, lower in starch. And in fact, a lot of times that's where people start losing progress. This is just a little side note, but those are almost more difficult to track. If I'm looking at a half a cup or 4 ounces of potato or rice or oatmeal or fruit, 50 grams of an apple, that's very, very, very consistent. But if it's some spinach here and some lettuce and some of these veggies and that, a lot of people just end up not understanding that the insoluble fiber goes down into our large intestine. The anaerobic bacteria consume that, convert it to fat. It goes back up through the hepatic portal system, creating all of this gastric distress. And it's still maybe even more calories than we thought we're consuming. So, a lot of people, a lot of my clients who are just not progressing as fast as they thought they should, they're not losing enough body fat. Uh, Oftentimes I will look at their food logs and say, wow, we are eating so much fiber, so many vegetables, so much salad. Let's reduce some of that and put back in some starch. And all of a sudden they start losing weight and they feel much better. And it's not necessarily just the type of fiber, the type of starch. It was just harder to control the actual amount of energy, and they were inputting more than they thought. But going back to peak week, you shouldn't be experiencing that at all. And it shouldn't be that just the last 3 days you start pulling back a lot of fiber because we don't know how your body's going to respond. That may change your GI habits so that you're even more unpredictable on contest day. So I think these are the kind of things that people should start thinking about 2 or 3 weeks out, if not all the time, and just have the best GI motility and regularity that they can, because I really, some people, if you reduce fiber too much a day or two before the contest, they actually end up constipated and they feel worse. I mean, they feel absolutely worse. So you need the right amount of soluble and insoluble fiber at the right times of the day so that you feel like you can have as good of an evacuation bowel movement as you can on contest morning. And I know it's never perfect because there's stress and anxiety, and people are waking up super early for hair and makeup appointments. And so it just seems to never be quite as good as a normal day, but we have to get as close as we can.
If let's say fiber is dialed in and there's not much of an issue of a fiber problem, it's more like a food volume problem. And again, it could be more like I'm looking into managing my hunger. I'm eating more like higher volume foods that are just going to make me feel fuller, but maybe that is affecting core control or just overall appearance in terms of like how much your digestion is capable of getting that through, mostly on the days that are closer to show day. Is this important to manage or not at all?
It's important because I want everybody to feel comfortable on stage, and if you do feel bloated or unable to control your abs and your core how you want, then I know you are going to feel like you're performing at less than your best. But for most people, judges and so forth, it's more of your own interoceptive perception than what's visually true. So like even if a client sends me progress photos and says, "Oh my gosh, I feel bloated and horrible," I look at the pictures and I can't tell any different than the day before. It's just not that noticeable. But when it's you feeling it and you're constipated or you can't use the restroom, then I know it can be problematic. So I'd love to see people try to dial that in ahead of time. The other thing, Astrid, that I think is important is for those who just don't have great bowel motility. I don't love using laxatives or things like that, but if you know, for example, that something works well for you, a certain food combination or a stool softener or something like that. I even have known, I don't know if there are any clients of mine. I remember a specific coach who would even just want to do kind of a colonic enema like the night before a contest and say, man, I don't do it all the time, but man, I just need to make sure my GI system is empty for that morning. Some people who are low in thyroid, for example, have low GI motility. So again, worst case scenario, but if that is a consistent struggle for somebody, I think that's something worth looking into, knowing how to be predictable with something like that.
Handling plateaus. I think it is really important for us to touch a little bit on that. How do you adjust a client plan when adherence could be great, but the scale isn't moving? And we know that scale is another area that can be very tricky because some, in my experience, some people have very steady weigh-ins on a regular basis, and there's no much issue. But I have seen other people that, including myself, perhaps, weight could fluctuate 1 kilo overnight, sometimes two. It just sometimes could be very mind-blowing. And it has nothing to do with progress. It's food volume, it's fiber, is stools, is stress like sleep, could be a lot of different things. But like when you visually see, you're visually seeing progress, you can take pictures over and over and see that your body is changing because you're adhering to the plan, but the weight is actually not moving almost at all. Like, how do you manage that? Knowing that obviously a scale is just a measurement tool, that is just a data point that will give us some information, but it has to be context dependent and it has to be put in the right place, looking at other variables that are going to give us more context. But if you're looking into a weight loss, like your plan, you have a how do you say, you have forecasted a weight of loss, and that
Mhm.
you knowing that you are on track for the show day, like that you're actually going to be in your best physique possible, but your weight doesn't necessarily change as much, but your physique does. How do you adjust in this situation?
I think, knowing the context of where you are in the process is important. So initially, there are, some steps of dieting where you're losing muscle glycogen and therefore water. And so body fat loss appears to, because it's on the scale, be a little bit quicker. But then within a couple of weeks, your metabolism is adjusting. Thyroid hormone will typically kind of drop down, and then at least in most of the studies, it stays pretty level. Um, but then you might see decreases in non-exercise activity. People are, very well versed in reading some of these, studies, and so there's a little bit of a steady decline that is energy expenditure dependent. You are also getting lighter and leaner and healthier, and so the demand on your cardiovascular system and muscular system is less. So you just truly need fewer calories. So you have to plan on readjusting calories a few times here and there. Very much like you said, some people are super steady and eerily consistent. They seem to lose a couple ounces every single day perfectly linearly. Other people are up and down all over the place, but yet the trend line continues to go as planned. So keeping your eyes on as many variables as possible, any kind of body comp analysis, plus the scale, plus visually. But when you get really down to the end and body fat percentage is just a much, much smaller part of your body composition, it may be a couple of weeks, 2, 3 weeks, and you just don't see the scale moving at all. But even something like caliper measurements would show a significant subcutaneous body fat reduction. Your photos continue to show great progress. So, we eventually do have to see the scale matching that to some degree, but it is a visual sport. Unless you have an exact weight class that you have to fit into, then of course, that may take some peaking manipulation to weigh in how you want. But from just pure body fat loss, having as many checkpoints as possible, whether it's an in-body scan or a STICU or hydrostatic weighing or DEXA scans. Some people still have calipers that they use as a little bit of a skin fold trial. But definitely to your point, it's more than just the scale.
Refer to body composition analysis. what technique or how do you prefer monitoring body fat composition? Because you still can get a lot of error, and it could be still a little bit tricky if you're not following or standardizing your protocols or using the same machine or using the same method. So what is your go-to method for measuring body composition? And if you do choose one, how do you ensure that this is going to actually be a reliable information?
Having the same equipment is helpful. So if a client goes to a gym where they have an in-body or a staiku, then I know that's going to at least give us some data points that are consistent that way. Certainly the same time of day in the same contexts. So if you do it, even just once a month, is it always on a Saturday morning? Is it always the day after you've trained legs or something like that can help with just hydration levels and so forth. But as you mentioned, it's still going to have some variables that are, very concerning to a lot of people. So as many data points as you have, I think that's helpful. I recall a client who just finished her season, and she had access in her own medical facility to an in-body, and so she could do it every single week. And you would just see things plodding along perfectly, and then one day it would be wrong. It would be like, wow, it looks like you lost 2 kilos of muscle. And then it's like, the next week it's like, nope, that was an error, and it, continues right down. So the problem with doing it too infrequently is if you get a bad reading, it may worry you unnecessarily. So, again, it's a visual sport. So the more video clips you're taking of yourself, the more photos you're taking in your suit with different lighting, perhaps even different times of the day, just trying to get some variance so you get a true understanding of how you look. You would just have to put as many pieces of that puzzle together as possible.
When it comes to training now, we haven't spoken much about that. And energy expenditure, we can look at three variables. We could look at resistance training, aerobic exercise or cardio, and your NEAT or non-exercise activity thermogenesis measuring steps. Out of these three, what are some of the aspects that you think are the most important to manipulate when it comes to energy expenditure, and whether you track all of these variables all the time? And like I know that there are coaches that they use energy expenditure, like actually how much energy are you spending in each sort of activity, to see a relative number that is giving you some information about your energy expenditure. And so it could help making some decisions whether you're hitting the mark with your exercise, the intensity, or a consistent energy expenditure at the end of the day to match our goals of weight loss. How does this measuring energy expenditure matters if we know that it could be so imprecise, but could be precise for you if you're using the same tool for yourself to measure just relative information that can help somehow in decision making?
So I like to look at these as all incredibly important pieces.
Mhm.
But if you get too specific about something like daily step count, oh my goodness, I didn't get in my steps today. It's almost like saying, well, my fat was 5 grams too high, or my carbs were 10 grams too high. Oh my gosh, I just blew the whole day. And you just get into this anxiety that's unnecessary. And so if you look at the big pieces in a week, you may have 6 out of 7 days that you were perfect on neat, but one wasn't great. You got all your workouts in, but one wasn't super high energy. You could literally be 98% perfect for the week, but if you're only myopically focused on the one thing you didn't do well, it's going to make the whole journey pretty arduous and pretty frustrating. So I think looking at the entire process of, are you losing enough, not just this week, but maybe the whole month. I often do that for clients. I'll say, okay, here's kind of our goal, but let's try to lose 6 pounds a month instead of just like a pound or a pound and a half a week. Um, and that can help diffuse some of that anxiety a little bit, where you don't have to be so perfect in one day or one week, because you and I both know, we've addressed it here already, that you're going to have some ups and downs because of all those different variables: sleep, stress, hormones, GI system, etc. But I really do, like to look at the facts that basal metabolic rate is still the highest measurement of your expenditure. Then you've got something like NEAT, which is going to be a pretty good, maybe 20 to 30% of your calorie expenditure that day. Then intentional exercise is the smallest, but I also think that can be very, very impactful. So you mentioned training intensity. Somebody who just does a set of 10 at an, RIR of 3, and then they sit down for 3 minutes and look at their phone, and then they do another set and sit down and look at their phone, versus the person who is really moving more quickly in the gym and they're just training at a little bit higher intensity. That can double the amount of calories you're burning in an hour. There is so much that the exercise science community is looking at to research some of these details. And, people like Krieger and Schoenfeld and Aragon, all the people who are doing some of this great nuanced research, end up showing us that, well, here's this nice big range, this much volume per week, this much frequency per week, this many steps, and so forth. And so it still comes down to how you individually interact with every one of those variables. I'll give you an example. At the height of my career, I was deadlifting and squatting over 500 pounds. I was, my performance was way up here. Even today, if I did the exact same workouts, the exact same amount of sets, the muscle output is way less because I'm only half as strong. I can't do that any longer. So even the amount of load I'm using can impact my calorie usage. And that may fluctuate week to week. Maybe you're on a non-linear periodization type of training program where one week is heavier, one week is a little bit more intensity based. So every week is not even going to be the same. So I think we just have to, again, look at all of these pieces together in their totality, and just look at it a week at a time, a month at a time, and not necessarily, every single day as a win or a loss.
How do you use biofeedback to determine or to use it for adjustment in your plan during contest prep and post-show recovery phase, in that recovery phase? Like if you just look at biofeedback, looking at energy, mood, cravings, hunger, libido, all of these areas that are going to be changing as you get leaner and leaner. How do you monitor this and how do you use it for you to get informed decisions that are going to help you modify or adjust the plan, whether it is during contest prep, and we're looking at how the client is moving towards show day, and then this same biofeedback, how important that is once you have completed your show day and now you move into a phase of post-show recovery, or however you want to call it.
This is an interesting area that I love the progress I've seen other coaches take. Because back when I started 30 years ago, it was very technocratic. It's, here's the nutrition plan, here's lipolysis, gluconeogenesis, this, that, and all of these pieces that we're managing, or at least I was managing as a coach. And so, now that this is a real industry and we're all doing this full time, you just have so many more opportunities to communicate with clients about these more integral things, like we're talking about how you feel, how was your recovery, how was your mood. I see a lot of coaches including that on check-in questionnaires. They literally want a rating of some of these biofeedback mechanisms. And I think that is both incredibly fantastic. I think that's great that we all have a higher level of awareness, but we also have to be careful, because what we focus on, can become a little bit of an obsession sometimes. And I'll give you an example: the old neuroscience cliche, what fires together wires together. If I ask a client who has a particular negativity bias, or they're just not generally a happy person, hey, how you feeling? And they're like, oh, I feel like shit. I feel like crap. Oh, I'm never sleeping great. My spouse sucks. My kids, and everything's always negative, 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 negative. if I consistently ask them about that, then that's what they're focusing on. And our brains feel that more deeply. And so sometimes we need to almost distract people from those things. Like we need to infuse positivity into them instead of asking them questions that harbor negativity. So I know that's a little bit of an outlier, because as I started, I really do think it's better to go deeper with clients and talk about their personal psychology and their social psychology and what's happening in their lives. We just have to be aware of some of those things that, we need to maybe sometimes distract clients from some of those and help with different strengths in their personality traits.
in your prep? Overrated or underrated?
So, true biofeedback, and I don't want to break away semantically from where you want to go, means that I have some interoceptive reaction. I'm feeling something in my body, but yet then I can measure it to something objective. So, for
Mhm.
example, a study with continuous glucose monitoring, they were able in under 8 weeks, they used a cohort of adults and children, and they were able to teach these people, both adults and kids, when you feel like this, when you feel hungry or you feel a little hypoglycemic, energy levels are coming down, here's what your blood sugar level was. And so they could measure that, the biofeedback against an objective measurement. So within 8 weeks, the kids were able to achieve that understanding at a 90% level. They could say, "Oh, I'm hungry. Is it time to eat yet or not? Oh, maybe that was just a craving because I don't necessarily feel like my blood sugar is lower." They were able to really learn how to feel their correct blood sugar level with 90% accuracy, and the adults were 80%. So, depending on what kind of tools you're using for that true biofeedback mechanism, it just that's I don't know many things that you can measure, um, but in terms of just interoceptive perception, like, am I gonna if I feel real anxious, for example, like I'm super, super stressed and cortisol is surging through my body and my adrenal glands are pumping out this cortisol, we know that can increase hunger, both from an emotional stress level as well as a blood sugar level. And so, do I need to sit down, close my eyes for 10 minutes, maybe lay on the ground for 2 minutes, take a breath? Like, is there something like that that I can do to change the physiological state in my body in a true mindfulness way? Then I think those are absolutely phenomenal things to do, all in that umbrella of mindfulness. But is there any actual tool that you're describing with biofeedback? Anything that you use or you're considering?
The times that I have seen and we've used these tools is more like subjective data. So a scale from 1 to 10, how hungry
Mm.
you are. The scale from 1 to
Okay.
10, how is your energy levels? How is your performance? How is your um, sleep from 1 to 10? Or how many hours are you sleeping a night? Whether that is consistent. And how is your performance from 1 to 10? Or um, your food focus, how from 1 to 10? And it could be obviously so subjective that it's going to be variable day to day, but could this still help to see some trends?
I really do. Yeah, I really do like that, Astrid, in that it does help people start to make it as objective as possible because something that starts out very subjective, it's comparative. So even if it's in small blocks of time, if I ranked my hunger or mood or libido or sleep 5 yesterday, if it's improved a little bit today, I have to at least be a 6. And then if I really feel amazing, maybe it's a 9 or a 10. And so we at least get used to creating our own scale. And that's what I love about perceived effort, like, reps in reserved and that kind of thing. That is a fantastic way to start being able to at least try to make it more objective. So yeah, I love all those things that a lot of coaches use now.
For example, when I zoom out from my spreadsheet where I have been tracking all of this data and even the subjective data, these are scaled from 1 to 10 and some of these areas of biofeedback, I can see how at the beginning of the prep, my energy levels were 8, 7, 10, like ranking in the high levels. Getting closer to peak week and show day, my energy levels were 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5 if I was lucky. And then same with hunger. My hunger levels started from like when I started 0, 1, 2, like really, really low, being hunger like super, super hungry 10 and no hungry 0. And getting closer and closer to peak week and show day, it was like I always was it 1, 2, 0 sometimes. Food focus, same thing. So I think it kind of gave me patterns and sort of information of okay, you're expected to see things shift as you move across your prep. And so is this information the same that you want to see in reverse when you're coming out of prep and out of show? You want to see hunger levels go down, energy levels go up, intensity of your training kind of like feel like you're recovering well, go up, food focus come down as you progress. Is it something that you probably pay attention to or you expect to change like that? Or what are some of your thoughts about that?
It's so variable. This is where we could never compare one person to another.
Yeah.
And even our own memory or recollection, like you 6 months ago at the beginning of a diet versus now, I don't know. Did I really know how I felt back then? Can I recall it? But as I said, more like I'm comparing today to yesterday. Um, this goes back to those people I mentioned, friends, clients, coaches who just never seem to be knocked off course. They can do anything, they never crack under pressure. You can have somebody who has a $200 steak fillet and it's just not cooked perfectly. And so they say this was awful. It was awful. It's a 0 out of 10. And then somebody else has a stale piece of bread that they haven't eaten in 3 days. And they say that's a 10 out of 10. It was amazing. I feel great. So just your own personal psychology and your expectations are a big backdrop to how you're going to rate yourself in a personal subjective survey. Um, and we know, for example, you get into Dr. Robert Sapolsky, famous neuroscientist who does all this work in behavior, and he points out things like the single biggest common denominator in a judge's sentencing, whether they're going to be super harsh or super lenient, is how long it's been since they've eaten. So even a judge who has a criminal's life in their hands, the biggest variable that will dictate how he sentences that person is how hungry he is. And so even somebody like that can't be objective when that's their entire job. So us day to day with different sleep, different mood, I think it's important to take those inventories, But we as coaches and clients ourselves, we just can't put a huge amount of stock into that. It's basically just, how am I doing right now? How is this week going? How is this day going? If every day is getting worse and worse, I need to make a change. Like, something needs to get better. I need to get more sleep. I need to change my schedule. So again, I like them as touch points, but I just wouldn't put a huge amount of stock into them being super, super accurate.
Let's move to a rapid fire Q&A. Okay, let's start with true and false. So I'm going to give you a statement, and I would love to hear from you whether you think it is true, is it false, is it something in between, and maybe you're rational, a little bit of a rational for this. So the first one is, you should eliminate all fiber, carbonated drinks, artificial sweeteners, sugar-free gum during peak week to avoid bloating gas, especially for those who struggle with IBS or core control. True or false?
False, but the caveat is I do think consistency is important and monitoring. So if somebody has an extreme habit, like maybe they chew 50 pieces of gum a day, well, maybe during peak week, we should reduce that by half or something. Just if there's anything extreme, it may be moderated, but it's completely false that you have to eliminate all of those things.
So for example, someone who has been drinking all the entire prep Diet Coke, and they go and it's part of their liquid and fluid intake, would you still keep that even every day of peak week, even if it's part of their habit, or would you consider removing some of that or everything at all just to reduce gas or something like that?
It would again come down to the amount. So if somebody has a habit of having an energy drink a day or a diet soft drink every day, I have no problem. But if they're drinking a ton of it, then I would probably say let's try to be as moderate and consistent as possible. So yeah, it's very rare that I would say just completely eliminate something just because it's peak week.
What happens if the person has core control, poor core control, or IBS? Would that change your approach?
Again, I would go back to we should have been correcting that all along. I mean,
Hmm.
that's just something that really needs to be addressed. And again, too many changes during peak week, and you may create a worse problem for somebody.
The timing of your last meal before stepping on stage can make or break your appearance. True or false?
It's very true.
Why?
Just well, for example, we'll start with something like sodium or minerals. If you are running late between meals and you haven't eaten for 3 or 4 hours and you normally would have, that amount of glucose and sodium, and therefore something like a sodium mediated glucose uptake process in your small intestine, you could be getting flatter and flatter and flatter. For example, at the WNBF World Championships this last weekend, I was in Boston with one of my clients. He was in the pro bantamweight class, and they had them on stage for 45 minutes. And the judges told him, in those 45 minutes, you kept looking better and better and better and better. And had he missed a last meal or enough hydration or something, he could have been getting flatter and flatter and softer. So, again, context is everything. Everything in your bloodstream and acutely coming into your bloodstream from your stomach and small intestine, all of that matters. And we can't be perfect and predict every little variable every minute of the day, but it sure is our goal as coaches to make sure for the moment they step on stage till they're off, whether it's 2 minutes or 45 minutes, we need to be ready to sustain that. So absolutely, the food you've done all day, the hydration, the minerals, even up to the last minute before you go on stage, it definitely has an impact.
Sodium manipulation. Is it necessary to achieve peak week conditioning?
Not manipulation, but knowledge, consistency, and adjustments. So if through auditing, I know a client usually consumes 4,000 milligrams of sodium a day, and it's distributed pretty evenly over 5 or 6 meals. Well, I probably want to see that same level all week. I don't want to see 8,000 milligrams one day and 4,000 another day. And I'm certainly not manipulating it like a sodium load and sodium depletion because sodium is so integral to muscle cell hydration. I want it consistent and even, and I want to know what those levels are so that when we're getting into the last couple days and even the last couple of hours before stage, I may be adjusting sodium, saying let's use this food or let's use this mineral, packet or something like liquid IV or something like that element to have this impact on your body. But it's only those small fine tuning adjustments at the end that allow us to do that because we've had such a baseline of consistency all week.
Post-show weight rebound is inevitable. True or false?
Definitely not inevitable, especially if you've been building your food intake up to the show. You got leaner, you got lean enough soon enough so that you can increase food. Then your food intake is probably already there. Um, for example, this client I'm describing, this was his third contest in 2 months. He was already eating off-season levels of food. That's preferable. That's a great goal. But even somebody who's been dieting pretty aggressively, you can control the reversing process to a degree that you are recovering nicely, but without unwanted body fat. It's not easy, but all the discipline and control you've exerted before the contest, like just hang on to that and be moderate and incremental on the way back up.
Most competitors benefit from a test run or mock peak week during prep. True or false?
That's probably somewhere in the middle because it's never completely reproducible. If you're doing a mock peak week 3 weeks before the contest, or 6 weeks before the contest, or even the week before peak week, your body's still in a different situation.
Hmm.
Metabolically, your food intake is different. And so while I think you can learn some good things, it's you first of all have to be willing to sacrifice perhaps that week of progress, because if it's a mock peak week, it may disrupt your actual progress that you needed. What I really prefer to do, Astrid, is just be incredibly observant all the way through. If a client has been dieting and they've lost 5, 8% of their body fat or body weight, and we've been dieting for 20 weeks, 24 weeks, I'm already seeing progress photos and changes all along. And especially the last couple weeks before a contest, we're probably looking at photos every day, sometimes multiple times a day. So I'm already taking notes and seeing how their body reacts to different things. So I don't necessarily need a trial run, but it is great when you work with clients year after year after year and you've just got all that data. Like their bodies, you've kind of learned a lot of things with them, and so it becomes much easier over time.
Vacuums for core control and improving your appearance on stage. Are they are so vital and important. True or false?
I'm going to go halfway in the middle again because your abdominals are four muscles: internal and external obliques, transverse abdominis, rectus abdominis. They all connect on the same fascial sheath. So just like a cinch sack, a garbage sack, like they all contract simultaneously and they also relax simultaneously. And when you're doing a vacuum pose, you're you're inhibiting some muscle like in your abs, maybe even in your low back, quadratus lumborum, etc. And yet you're actively learning to control your diaphragm. So your diaphragm is normally an autonomic nervous system muscle. You're not actively right now trying to contract your diaphragm to get air into your lungs. But when we're doing vacuums, we're teaching somebody to do that. We're relaxing part of our abdominal wall and then we're contracting or relaxing our diaphragm. So I think it can be helpful for another true biofeedback mechanism. Like we're actively asking our body to do something that's not necessarily voluntary, and to control it at our will and make it more automatic. So I think there's value, but I don't think it's not going to change your rib cage. Like I hear a lot of posing coaches tell their clients, "Oh, it's going to make your ribs look more narrow. You're going to control the floating ribs, and you're going to do this and that." And while it's true from just a normal posing, it doesn't do anything that changes your skeletal structure. It's just that changing something into a more natural way of posing.
Does that help to still show a little bit more flatter, like physically look thinner, if you can master that vacuuming for posing?
Well, so that's an interesting thing because almost like in bikini posing, we know that doing, for example, a stiff-legged deadlift where you posteriorly tilt your pelvis, like that's how you maximally contract your glutes and hamstrings. Yet in bikini posing, you have to do an anterior pelvic tilt. So you're doing the opposite where now you can't contract your glutes. You if you are trying to contract your abs, which will literally contract your internal and external obliques, that will literally flatten out your lower rib cage. You can't do that and vacuum at the same time. It's totally opposite. It's two completely antithetical movements. So by practicing the vacuums and by integrating into your voluntary control your diaphragm, you can get in and out of those poses more easily. And sometimes maybe you want to vacuum up to show a thinner waist, but then you're not contracting your abs. You know, if you want to contract your abs, you have to crunch down, which is the opposite of a vacuum. So I think the biggest goal is just it gives you greater automatic control of your breathing and how you are contracting or vacuuming when and where you want. But that's the key. Like somebody doing that on stage, you have to be in control of that process and be showing the judges the exact look you want.
Let's move to this or that. Now, water loading or gradual hydration adjustments for peak week.
Very similar to sodium. I'm going to keep hydration very much the same because we know with aldosterone levels and what your kidneys doing, all the nephrology processing of your GI system, your I'm sorry, your urinary tract. Um, when you sleep, everything changes. That's when you go into just brainstem autonomic control. And so no matter whether you had 4 liters of water or 6 or 8 liters, as long as you're getting enough water the night before, it just doesn't matter. Drinking more, you're going to leach out more minerals, which may have an impact, but we don't have to do anything other than just keep your water the same. And then on contest morning, that's when you have to decide what you're going to do. And I will tell you, I'm having much better results with clients making sure that as soon as they wake up on contest day, they are really well hydrated. We don't just kind of ease into water. We're super well hydrated in the morning, and then we taper back off to a normal amount because I want urination and everything from a kidney perspective to be very normal. And then if we need to increase or decrease closer to the stage, we're dealing with that as a backdrop where your body's not homeostatically ranging from one extreme to another.
Big refeed day or a smaller multiple refeeds across the week.
A little bit on body type. Um, s- and I guess, maybe how fast you need to lose, how much body fat you need to lose. Um, I will say some of the research, particularly by Dr. Helms, has prompted me to look at maybe a 2-day refeed process instead of just necessarily one meal. But for some people, I will say it helps to have a pretty big influx. So if I'm asking a client to add 100 or 150 grams of carbs on one particular day, I wouldn't say add 20 grams over 5 meals or 25 grams over 5 meals. I would say, have 10 or 15 extra here, 10 or 15 there, but let's also have an extra 50 or 75 in this one meal because we really do want more of a glycogen replenishment. But also, like I said, it kind of depends on their body type.
Okay. High intensity cardio or steady state cardio during the final prep weeks?
It's just two totally different tools. So the amounts of epinephrine and norepinephrine, the catecholamine hormones that you can generate elevations in with your high intensity cardio have so much impact that I always want some kind of high intensity cardio in. But because that is such a bigger orthopedic demand and takes more recovery in hamstrings, glutes, knees, hips, low back can get sore, we definitely have to moderate it. So as we're getting into peak week, I definitely pull intensity down. But I'm somebody who has a pretty steady amount of low intensity, moderate intensity cardio in, never overdoing it. Kind of the minimum effective dose is important. But I also try to have little spikes of high intensity work, even if it's just once a week, just to do something kind of athletic to really open up the cardiovascular system.
When you think about high intensity cardio, what protocols or what does come to mind?
Great question, because what dictates cardiovascular work is really how much muscle tissue at one time is being utilized at what level, like kind of a METS or a Watts type level. So, for example, if you're just doing sprints on a track or a treadmill, it's going to be dominantly hamstrings, calves, glutes, eccentrically, quads. But if you're on an assault bike or you're doing something functional like burpees, where you're using upper body muscle, lower body muscle, um, you just get more impact that way. So the more muscle tissue you're using all at once can be very effective, but you also have to spread out that orthopedic stress. So I don't necessarily want a client to always use the same method. Maybe this week, it could be even in the same workout. Maybe you're doing 5 minutes really hard on the rowing machine and then 5 minutes really hard on the arc trainer. And then you do, three Wingate sprints, or you do just, five 30-second sprints on a treadmill. And so that way you're not doing the same thing the entire time.
Let's look at reverse diet or recovery diet.
I like to argue a little bit with my friend Eric Helms on this, because the recovery diet method, or his premise, is you feel like shit, you've been dieting this long, your hormones are depressed, we got to hurry up and get you back up here. And so let's hurry up and gain 2, 3, 4, 5% body fat. Except that just that body status of having more body fat isn't necessarily what brings you back up to those levels. It takes time for your entire central nervous system. These hormones we're talking about, whether it's the androgens or the thyroid hormones or the catecholamines, they don't just flip on a switch just because you gained, 2 pounds or added 2% body fat. So I'm interested in recovery and bringing people back up, but I can still do that incrementally. It doesn't have to take 6 months. You can bring somebody back up within 4 to 6 weeks without any unwanted body fat, and still be perfectly fine. So it's probably a matter of semantics, but at least how recovery diets have been defined, I prefer more of a more gradual approach.
When you do this gradual approach, do you pull back cardio energy expenditure a lot more, or do you manipulate? You kind of keep it roughly the same and start just manipulating calories first, and then seeing how body responds. Then, okay, let's adjust a little bit of cardio. Obviously, you don't want to have the same levels that you were doing pre pre contest, but you don't also want to take all that off.
Yeah, I don't think there's any reason to taper cardio back super slowly. Like, you've been doing cardio 6 days a week. Let's go to five for a month and then four for a month. I mean, you can reduce that all the way back to just a functional standard level that you enjoy. So whether that's one or two, you know, but I would say we can pull that back and let your body start recovering more that way, and then increase food accordingly. I really look at calorie increases in kind of 100 calorie blocks. 200 calories, 100 calories, something like that. I know a lot of coaches will tell a client, okay, let's add 5 grams of fat this week, and then let's add 10 grams of carbs this week, and that's just so innocuously benign. I don't think you can make enough change. So I'm coming up a couple hundred calories or 100 calories at a time until we gradually find that point of stability.
How do you feel about including or mixing in a bit of a hybrid method, bringing some mindfulness and intuitive eating within that recovery phase, giving the client to kind of like get back to their own hunger cues and the knowing how to slow down, feeling their hunger, feeling their satiety, and sort of reconnecting with those skills that sometimes while you're losing weight and you're focused on losing body fat, you have to ignore some of these cues and some of these things. And so how do you think it kind of incorporating this intuitive, informed mindfulness, intentional eating within that recovery phase would work? And rather than having a specific number that they have to follow, especially in this recovery phase, having more like a little bit of a range of calories where they can fall into that allows them to feel like psychologically they have less restriction, but they also can start, okay, I feel like I could need a little bit more calories today and I'm listening to my body. Maybe tomorrow I don't need as much. And so they are still kind of like playing within that. How do you feel about that?
I love ranges. I use this with my lifestyle general population clients as well. And so, especially off season or transitioning into the off season, I would much rather say something like, well, let's shoot for 175 to 200 grams of carbs. Let's shoot for 50 to 60 grams of fats. And maybe the averages are working out exactly where we want it anyway, but it does give some flexibility, as you said. It is definitely a place that's uh, kind of fraught with landmines for people who are not prepared for some increased hunger. I'm sure you've experienced this, and from clients where they start eating more food and they think, great, man, as soon as I can eat another 200 or 300 calories, I'm going to feel amazing. And then they just feel hungrier. Like it's like, wow, I feel I'm ravenous now. And so if we call that intuitive, then unfortunately some people can eat their way up 20 or 30 pounds and then they're just a wreck. They feel horrible. So we have to be very careful that some of those cues inside of our body aren't hunger but instability, going back to the insulin model of weight loss and so forth. I mean, even though that's not necessarily the number one way we think about diet now, it still has impact. When you have these um, not barometric the baroreceptors in your stomach and small intestine for volume distension and so forth. And then when you go through, what's called phase 3 epigastric contractions, where now your stomach's empty, the amount of hunger you can feel can change greatly. And so a month before you were in your diet and you didn't feel that hungry, now you're eating more food, but you feel hungrier. So I think we still need some objectivity to help our clients. Like, let's keep one eye on the scale, let's keep one eye on the food intake. But of course, we want to honor their intuitions and their hunger and levels of satiety.
I think something that works really well is control flexibility. So you do have some control, you do have some flexibility, but you kind of like have put some boundaries and some rules in place. So let's say, okay, you're going to have a little bit more calories, but you're going to continue to eat exactly the same foods that you were eating during your prep. Like it's just more food. Like let's not eat like highly palatable foods or things that are just going to drive your food desire much higher, or that can spiral into a binge because it tastes so good that you won't be able to stop once you start. Keeping your daily steps, keeping things that you really want to kind of like keep standardized. So there is flexibility, but there's also some boundaries that you need to adhere to while doing this phase of recovery as well.
I remember, ironically, speaking to Lane Norton on one of his podcasts. He invited me on probably 15 plus years ago, and he had uh, read some articles I was writing on what I called structured flexibility. So there was this opposing, um, binary of here's high structure and here's high flexibility. And I said, well, we need both. It's like the brick that you build a wall with, but you can't build it with just bricks. You need the mortar. So structure and flexibility, structured flexibility. And that can take many forms, and like you've described, the ranges, or one day is a little bit higher because you're hungrier than another. There's all kinds of ways we can employ that, but if you're super rigid on just one, then I think you're missing the whole point. I think we need both.
Let's move to this one part that I love asking about. So, diuretics for peak week, overrated or underrated?
Overrated for sure. I mean, our muscle tissue is 65 to 75% water. Without hydration, especially something like diuretics that may indiscriminately flush water, especially prescription diuretics. It's not about having less water in your body. It's directing that it's intracellular, and so yeah, absolutely. If it's the mineral based diuretics, things that have dandelion root and calcium, magnesium, other minerals, I think those can be helpful as long as they're steady. Like, you're just kind of like a vitamin. You're taking a certain amount each day, spread out throughout the day. But even that's not necessary. So I would say very underrated or
Fat
overrated.
bur
Overrated. We don't need it.
Overrated. Fat burners in your prep, overrated or underrated?
Maybe in the middle. Sometimes you need a little situational hit of caffeine. Research is pretty clear that it's very ergogenic and can create some extra transitional energy. So it's useful, but don't over rely on it. Don't use it in place of good sleep and recovery. But matter of fact, caffeine is so adaptive that whatever your norm is becomes your new zero. So you just don't want to over rely on it.
We talk a little bit about the test runs or mock peak weeks, overrated or underrated?
Overrated in terms of putting all your eggs in that basket. That here we had this mock peak week and it was perfect. So now we just have to do the exact same thing. Again, your body's in a different place. You've traveled, sleep could be different. And so you're just not going to get as much information as you think.
Posing practice, overrated or underrated?
Underrated. You should definitely start posing early and often. I'm not a fan of posing for an hour a day, but if 6 months before your contest, if you're practicing even 5 minutes a day, doing that every single day is going to be way better than just trying to cram it all in at the end.
100%. Post-show recovery strategies for mental health and physical health, underrated or overrated?
Underrated. I mean, you've got to find a way to deal with the letdown, all of that mental energy and obsession that you've had for months and months and months, and all of a sudden it's over. It just comes to a screeching halt, and it's almost like postpartum depression. All of your dopamine has been focused on this one thing, and now it's just gone. So you've got to learn how to fall in love very quickly again with just the training and the process, and expanding the other parts of your life that you've been kind of constricting for a while. But a lot of people struggle with that. And so I think it's very important to think about it, anticipate it, and plan for it.
Including high intensity cardio in the final weeks of prep, over or underrated?
Probably underrated, because you need some, but like I said, I would taper it off a little bit toward peak week, and probably no high intensity work in peak week. But you're definitely still working at a pretty functional, optimal level up until the last week or two.
Carbohydrate sources like rice versus potatoes for peak week. Overrated or
Well,
underrated?
I like both of those because they're very easy to digest, but one has a lot of potassium and one doesn't. And so I think you got to know in context like what you're trying to accomplish with micronutrients, not just macronutrients. Um, but also comes down to just what you digest. Some people do well with oatmeal, some people don't. Some people like to include some fruit, some people don't. So as long as it's something your body is used to and we're seeing consistency with that, I think that's perfectly fine.
Avoiding all processed foods during contest prep.
No, yeah, I think we all feel better with less processed food, but you don't have to avoid it completely. Certainly not.
Last one, but not least, psychological preparation and mindset coaching during contest prep.
Incredibly helpful. You may not need a mental health therapist or a counselor with you every step of the way, but good coaches are at least empathetic and interested in all aspects of a client's life and their journey, not just the mechanical body fat loss. Um, so I think most coaches are there. Obviously, there are so many good coaches now, and the good ones rise to the top. So I think that's very important.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being so transparent and having had the time to go all this time with me through all of these details and all things contest prep and show day and peak week.